Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. John, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Even though the topic is going to be scary oriented, it's going to be a fun chat.
Oh, and thanks, Robbie, for inviting me onto this show.
Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, sure, sure. My name's Jon Towlson. I'm a film critic and an author, and so far I've sort of specialised in horror cinema. And I first started publishing books in 2014, and the first book that came out was Subversive Horror Cinema. And I think that's the book, Robbie, that you mentioned earlier that we're going to be discussing, or themes relating to that. But I've also written on other sort of areas of horror as well. I've written a monograph on Candyman, a book on Dawn of the Dead. I wrote a book on 1930s horror cinema, and my latest book is a book about cult movies called 40 Cult Movies, a collection of essays on a selection of cult movies from the 1930s onwards.
I have to ask why you're interested in horror cinema. Like, did you just always been a horror fan?
Yeah, I think a lot of it arises from that. I was always a movie fan from childhood. I liked all sorts of fantasy as a kid. I used to read fantasy, Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and read comics. I grew up in the 1970s in England, and horror was really in the firmament. Horror was on television. It was even on sort of children's television in the 70s until TV shows like Children of the Stones and so on, which I think any UK listeners of a certain age will probably be familiar with. So I kind of grew up into it. I was a film fan, but I liked all stuff. I like James Bond movies and anything to do with adventure, action adventure. But I think the horror, I don't know. I think it perhaps kind of got into under my skin in a way because I was quite an anxious kid. So I think horror really kind of I connected with that of all the genres, the closest. And then from my childhood, I kind of I went into filmmaking and started shooting my own films on 16 mil, not horror movies. I was kind of more inspired by directors like Ken Russell and Nicholas Roeg, that sort of tradition of British filmmaking. And from there, I went into teaching and writing, and sort of kind of found my way into film criticism, really, uh, through this route of teaching and filmmaking. And I think I just sort of again gravitated to horror because of that sort of childhood connection. And just found when I started writing about horror, I just kept the more and more I wrote about it, the more I researched it, the more there was to write about. So I just kind of kept going with it.
Do you look at how horror has evolved through time? I mean, you mentioned about writing something about the 1930s, but do you look at like what scares us? I've always been obsessed with that, like how it can range so wildly, but then there's still some things that scare, I think, all of us the same.
Yeah, I think that what really interests me is the sort of cultural context of horror. So there is an element of me investigating my own, what scares me personally, and therefore what scares other people. But there's also that thing about looking at why, how has horror evolved and how does it sit within a sort of wider cultural context, particularly in sort of the United States and the UK. And as I mentioned, sort of growing up in the 70s in England was a very, interesting time, uh, quite a um, politically quite a tumultuous time, with Margaret Thatcher coming into power in the 1970s. There was the miners' strike. There was a lot of social unrest in this country, as there was obviously in the States and other countries as well. And I guess I just had a little bit of a sort of antennae for picking up on the anxieties that were going on around me, that other people were feeling, and that would sort of be the way the media was sort of promoting certain levels of anxiety. Things like the rabies scare. We had this big scare in the 70s, which was sort of quite a xenophobic thing, really. The idea that rabies might come over from France and cause, social collapse in the UK. Um, so yeah, I think what's kind of interested me a lot is just really investigating horror as a whole genre. I think I'm just kind of fascinated by the genre as a whole, how it works, its limitations, its kind of crossovers to other genres, and the whole issue of how progressive is it, where does its progressive potential end, and the different how different filmmakers have come up over the years, over the different decades.
Can I ask about how I guess you would look at horror? Like if you were going to take me through like understanding horror films, you mentioned the progressiveness of it. How do you tell the politics? And usually I'm just waiting for someone's head to get chopped off half the time.
Yeah, well, the thing about any film really is that, of course, they're open to interpretation. So one person can read certain political messages into a film that another person might not read, or another person might read very different messages into the film. I've always been interested because I started as a filmmaker myself. I've really been interested in following the careers of certain directors like Romero, Jeff Lieberman, Cronenberg, or Carpenter, all of the main people into the sort of present day. Um, new waves of directors, the rise of women directors, indigenous filmmakers. So I think, as well as kind of looking at the movies themselves, I'm very interested in looking at the ideas of the filmmakers, the people who are sort of involved in making the films. I don't really completely subscribe to what's been described as a sort of reflectionist view of horror, the idea that horror simply reflects our fears. I think that filmmakers, I've met a number of filmmakers, interviewed many filmmakers, and without exception, they're all extremely intelligent, self-aware artists who look at what's going on around the world and sometimes quite consciously incorporate uh, ideas or even sort of political events into their films, sometimes in a sort of allegorical way, but there's, certainly I think most filmmakers are somehow influenced by what's going on in the world around them. And why shouldn't they? Because, every artist wants to be relevant. Every artist wants to somehow capture the zeitgeist because, um, that's a way of getting an audience. So as well as kind of looking at the films themselves and kind of offering a critic's interpretation, I'm very interested in.
Well, what would you say the characteristics of a horror genre are?
Um, there have been a number of theorists who've come up with different ways of sort of defining the genre. I think maybe Robin Wood gave a very succinct definition, which he said the horror genre was defined by the idea of normality being threatened by the monstrous, you know. So there's that kind of sense of a conflict going on between people in the film who represent some sort of sense of normality, who are challenged by this disruptive force, this very negative force, which is, kind of ultimately revealed that it's difficult to make the distinctions between the two. What is monstrous, what is normal. Um, so I think that's probably the definition that's kind of always kind of stuck in my mind when I've come to look at a movie. But obviously, there are so many crossover films nowadays, and uh, it, it's very difficult to actually, give any single hard and fast definition to what horror movie is, because you've got the influence of so many different genres. You've got comedy, horror, science fiction, not just the hybrid, but you've got films where horror is not necessarily a sort of generic um, trope within the film, such as the sort of art house horror, where there's a kind of a sense of horror rather than the just being, the typical monsters and so on.
It's crazy how they can make a place like a carnival be associated with scary or just horror in general. When I see that, I usually you're supposed to think fun. It's got all the circus stuff. You're supposed to think good times. But now every time I see it, I've seen too many horror movies more than I've actually seen carnivals. So it's like I'm always associating with like somebody. There's gonna be a killer clown at some point. That's always just pops into my mind whenever I drive by one.
Mm. Well, it's very interesting you say that about carnivals. Maybe in the States there's a greater tradition of, traveling shows, the carnival, than there is in Britain. But maybe there are some deep-seated thoughts or perceptions about carnival life and carnival people that have, come down over the years. The fact that, you run off to join the circus, that there's an old saying in this country, is that, the idea behind that the circus is somehow something that exists outside of the normal kind of society. So I think there's a fascination there about what actually goes on behind the scenes in carnivals. Um, but there's also a slight kind of um, paranoia, maybe.
Paranoia.
Yeah, that carnival people don't follow the same rules that people who kind of live in cities and towns and kind of lead
Yeah.
typical lives might follow. I guess there's also that sort of tradition of the freak show that sort of comes up through carnivals, and the idea that when you go to a carnival, you might be confronted by something that really challenges your um, sense of a sort of comfortable bourgeois normal life. You know, what do you think? You mean it's interesting you bring up carnivals. What's been your experience of
I've only
carnivals?
been to like three, I think, in my entire life, and they've all been under the age of like 15. So I would say that I mean, I guess they're fun experiences. I never went to I think what you would call what the word we're looking for is freak show or something. I've never seen that, but I think that's just people's adverse reactions to seeing something that isn't normal to them. Obviously, we all picture two arms, two legs, but if you're exploiting someone that has like Fish Boy or something like that, it makes me think of Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses, where he chops the dude in half and puts his lower or upper half on the lower half as a fish. He's like, see the merman, the spectacular merman. It's like, yeah, because we're just it's like being horrified at how disgusted you are, which really makes you analyze yourself a little bit. I mean, does that make someone feel better? But then I mean, I don't know. See, when it comes to carnivals, there you got movies like It, like with a clown, where there's a serial killer. I don't find that scary at all. I don't know. Maybe some people there's a large amount of people that have an irrational fear towards clowns. I don't know why, but it's a cultural thing. It's much like zombies. You can always toss that out. Usually, if I see a killer clown or if I see something like that, I immediately assume, horror movie, 100%.
Mm. I mean, I agree. I mean, I've never found clowns particularly frightening, but I mean, I know there have been so many movies about killer clowns, and uh, then, but maybe they do key into very childhood fears. When you go to the circus, the clown is not exactly a comforting character to a child. I think the clowns are kind of a fascinating character,
Literally, what he gets paid to do. He's paid to make you laugh.
made to make you laugh, but there's something grotesque about clowns as well, isn't there? The whole thing with the nose and the pancake, the pancake makeup and so on. You're kind of wondering what's underneath it. And I suppose it's the mask. The mask is a big horror characteristic. Every sort of monster has a mask that kind of masks their true identity, or you kind of wonder what is there behind the mask, and maybe clowns kind of key into that as well. Have you seen a movie called The Funhouse from early 1980s? Toby Hooper, who did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's a classic. You know, a bunch of teenagers break into a carnival at night, go into the fun house, but one of the exhibits in the fun house is a sort of deformed, um, sort of yeah, it's kind of almost like the Elephant Man kind of character, but with a sort of killer instinct. So that kind of plays into the idea of what is going on behind the facade of the of the carnival, and again kind of keys into that idea that maybe in some way these people, because they're not like us, there's a sort of depraved in some way, it's primitive, uh, or they hark back to our sort of primal past, kind of coming back to haunt us. So yeah, very interesting movie. The Fun House, one of Toby Hooper's best, I think.
How different are the horror films from the 1930s compared to the horror films of today? I mean, you got tropes like Dracula, werewolves, things. I mean, we still have those today. It's just different technology that creates those monsters. But there's just to me, I'm wondering if there's things that are the same and if there's things that are different, and how different are they? I mean, I'm looking for new stuff, but it seems like zombies have always been a cultural thing. It looks like, at least in the United States. You mentioned Dawn of the Dead earlier. I mean, I've seen the movie. I didn't really like it. But that's a big thing. Walking Dead's a big thing as well too.
Yeah, well, before I talk a little bit about the 30s horror, I mean, I have to say that I think that the Dawn of the Dead, the influence on The Walking Dead is enormous. The ideas that Romero puts forward in his whole series of Dead films have really kind of been carried on through The Walking Dead. The whole idea of society's collapsed. How do we create a new society that's better than the society that has gone? That's the main kind of conflict in Romero's films, and the main conflict in The Walking Dead is that they're always trying to battle against these tyrants. The people who set themselves up as leaders or dictators, and the whole idea is how do we move past that mindset in The Walking Dead. But in answer to your question about how different are the films, or what are the differences and similarities of the 1930s films and modern films, it's my contention that actually they're much more similar than they're often made out to be, especially the 1930s films. And the book I wrote about the 1930s films was called The Turn to Gruesomeness in the 1930s horror cinema. Because what I found was that very first flowering of the horror genre in the 1930s was as much influenced by the um, the sort of the tradition of theatre that promoted gruesomeness at the sort of turn of the century in England and in France, as it was by the Gothic novel, and movies from a sort of Frankenstein onwards sort of traded on the idea of them being gruesome, and they were even sort of promoted using that term gruesome as much as they were promoted using the kind of the newly developed label of horror. Um, and it was partly to do with the fact that in the 1930s, Hollywood was really struggling to get audiences, and they were turning towards sensational film subject matter. So we had gangster movies and sex pictures that sold movies, and then when the horror genre came out with Dracula and Frankenstein, and it really flowered, producers would started to look at sort of making movies quite gruesome, And of course, we're talking about gruesome by 1930s standards. But if you watch a movie like Murders in the Rue Morgue, you've still got scenes where, for example, Bela Lugosi has got a prostitute tied up, on a crucifix, which is a pretty shocking scene even today. That was, 1932. Uh, and eventually, those movies got censored by the Production Code Administration in the late 1930s. And when the 1940s came out, the horror movies of the 40s were much more tame in terms of their kind of what was shown on screen. They became much more reliant on kind of shadows and suggestion, and then kind of psychological horror sort of started to come in the 40s with the Val Lewton cycle. And it kind of got forgotten, really, I think, just how movies in the 1930s sort of traded on gruesomeness. Um, and then, of course, the horror genre in the kind of 70s, once the production code had collapsed and censorship started to become more relaxed in the States and in England, horror movies and other movies started to become much more explicit again. And it's funny because history kind of repeated itself, and you got a whole sort of chain of gangster movies coming out like Bonnie and Clyde, and then Western movies that became explicit, such as The Wild Bunch and Soldier Blue, and then horror movies became more and more sort of graphic and gruesome.
So wait, the production code offices were aware at the time of the production code offices were aware at the time that horror cinema was too gruesome that they wanted to censor it. I'm aware of the censorship by the offices only on the basis of like communist views and things that would be more in the political realm. But I mean, even sex stuff, that was a big thing that they wanted to censor as well too. But usually you hear about the McCarthy era with like the Red Scare, but I mean, it's interesting to me. I never heard of them censoring horror cinema before.
Yeah, they did. They did censor it. They censored it alongside. It's when the PCA started, uh, and really kind of the production code was reaffirmed and sort of tightened up when Joseph Breen came into office, and that was in late 1934. So the movies produced from sort of 1935 onwards were subject to a much tighter regulation of gruesomeness. And Breen managed to pretty much wipe out the gangster movie altogether, and was actively trying to dissuade producers from making more horror movies by 1936. And then in the United Kingdom, uh, the British Board of Film Censorship, as it was called at the time, they introduced an X certificate, which no, sorry, an H for horror, or H for horrific. Uh, Basically, they're just the regulatory bodies just tried to persuade Hollywood not to make any more horror movies because they were just too controversial. They were causing a lot of problems with pressure groups, church groups, and so on around the country. Um, so, as you probably know, from 1936 to late 1938, 1939, the studios pretty much stopped making horror movies in the United States. And when they did start making them again, there was a noticeable difference in the horror content. You producers didn't try to put as much kind of sensational content into the films after 1939.
Which do you think horror had a bigger conflict with when it came to groups? You mentioned the religious groups. Is that one of their biggest? I mean, when did the boundary, I guess, for horror films really change? Like when you start seeing directors be more edgier, kind of pushing that, like maybe I should throw this in there. Maybe I should to get to the point that we're at now. I would have to think that it would, if we talked about religion, just the amount of how we're not like so focused on it as much as like banning rock and roll was back in the day because they thought it was the devil's music. I would think now with what time we're in now, it's kind of people are pretty quiet about their religion in most groups, and a lot of people aren't offended by simple things that could be, a head getting chopped or something like that on screen. It's not seen as demonic. But then we have every film in this culture right now is about demons or possession or something like that, where I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think horror cinema has caused as much consternation for most religious groups and pressure groups as other genres, like, for example, the gangster movie or the sex film, because those films kind of, in a way, contravene religious, traditional Christian values in a much more direct way. Sex before marriage and via, antisocial behavior. And then again, when we got to the 50s, of course, there was the rise of the teenager and the so-called the sort of the juvenile delinquent sort of scare. So the kind of rock and roll movies were kind of targeted as being, a bad influence on teenagers and encouraging them to cause trouble. I mean, around about this in the 50s, I think maybe more significant in terms of horror censorship was the comics code in the 50s. The idea, the idea that kids could read comics and they'd be uh, depraved and corrupted by reading these comics. And a lot, you don't know whether it's because of the gruesome or, imagery, or whether it's just because a lot of those comics were quite subversive in their own way. That EC Comics employed a lot of writers that were very kind of cynical about what had happened in the Second World War, who pointed to a lot of hypocrisy in society in the 1950s, and the kind of those old EC comics are kind of moralistic in a funny sort of way, that if you're a bad person, you'll get punished by a ghoul coming out of the ground and getting you. And so it's hard to know exactly what the beef was with horror comics in the 50s, whether it was the gruesomeness and parents were going, oh, we don't think our kids should be reading these nasty comics, or whether it was the kind of perceived anti-American sentiment, that the comics might be thought to sort of espouse. I think the modern, in kind of my memory, living memory, uh, I think in the 1980s had a much more of a backlash against horror itself as a genre in England, and also I think in America as well, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, with the video nasties furore that happened in the 1980s in this country. What happened was, in the early 1980s, video recorders suddenly became popular. They became available to the average household. So people were going out and renting video recorders to watch movies at home for the first time. But the studios really weren't that interested in releasing their movies onto VHS, onto home video. So what happened in England was a lot of very small companies, independent companies, bought a very cheap product to put out on home video, and a lot of these movies were low-budget horror movies made in the sort of 70s in America, and a very kind of low-budget exploitation movies with a lot of gore and stuff like that. Talking about movies like I Spit on Your Grave and Driller Killer, and
Crazy titles, going out there, getting creative.
yeah, which had become sort of infamous. Um, and what happened was that the media kind of seized upon the idea that these movies were not being rated or certificated by the British Board of Film Censorship. So they could conceivably be seen by anybody at home, in the home, including children. So there was a big worry, very similar to what the worry that you get with social media now, that the media plays on this moral panic, creates and helps to create a moral panic that the media, or in the 80s, the VHS cassette was actually contributing to causing harm to children, depraving them and corrupting them. So a number of films in this country were prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act, because they were thought that they might have a very negative influence on children in this country. So that caused a big backlash against horror movies in the 1980s. And a law was passed called the Video Recordings Act in 1984 that stipulated that every movie released on home video had to be given a certificate. And that led to a number of horror movies being banned in the UK. And I think there was a similar sort of tightening up in the States in the late 80s and early 90s in terms of horror movies. And of course, this kind of made its way back into the industry and sort of started to make it harder for filmmakers to actually, get their films distributed. So studios and other producers who made a lot of money, had to be said, a studio like Paramount had made a lot of money out of a film like Friday the 13th in the late 1970s, early 1980s. But they, after about 1984, they sort of stopped making as many horror movies because they, found it hard to get them distributed, or there was, a taboo about them. And I think it even affected directors like Dario Argento in Europe, that suddenly the horror movie was not considered to be a good investment. But that's what happens when you cut off a marketplace, which is what happened in England in the early 1980s. The censorship was such that it pretty much cut off a marketplace for horror. And then the Video Recordings Act was tightened up even more, I think, in the early 90s, following a number of events that had happened in this country with killings and so on. And the media again tried to find links between those events and saying that kids had been influenced by watching horror movies. They'd been influenced to go out and cause crime. So it's all very, very kind of unfortunate, really. But I'll have to say that in living memory, maybe the Video Recordings Act was the most sort of damaging to the horror genre, horror industry.
Do you believe in the influence at all from horror films? Oh, that the irrational fear they might have had back then. Do you kind of look at it and try and examine any realistic approaches to it? Like if it had any sense to it, or was it just kind of obscene and they didn't really back then it was a very purist mindset, which a lot of people don't really realize is that everything back then, like no homosexuality, it was very, very tight marriage, family, this type of ideal that they had in their mindset, which we've evolved from that. But that was the only type of thinking, and anything outside that had to go away, had to go somewhere, but it couldn't stay here.
Mm. Well, I don't think it's ever been proven that there's any link whatsoever between, watching these films and developing any kind of antisocial behavior. But there is a possibility of a child being disturbed, in some way by watching these films. And I think maybe in most parents' mind, that's enough, is, the possibility that there might be some kind of negative influence on a child. I mean, I doubt many people would subscribe to the sort of tabloid press view that, if a child might watch a couple of video nasties and go out and commit a crime. I don't think most people wouldn't.
They say it about video games, but I don't know if I believe
It's
that.
the same with video games, I suppose it depends on whether you think a person is able to discriminate between what they're seeing on screen and what might happen in reality. Now that, I mean, I guess what I could say is that almost all of those video nasties that were banned in the 80s are now freely available, and they don't seem to be causing anyone to go out and cause any crimes now. And you would assume that if they had that power uh, and influence over somebody, then irrespective of which decade people watch those movies, they could be influenced by them. But the fact that they're out there now and don't seem to be influencing anybody to do anything antisocial probably suggests that a film in itself really doesn't have that power. And
You
in fact, the media seizing on it and turning it into a moral panic. In my experience, because I grew up through that, and in fact, I've seen most of the video nasties when I was early teenager. Most of them were just laughable, you know, and people really didn't take it that seriously at the time. I mean, I'm talking about friends and family and people who watch these films. The media really kind of seized on it, and if anything, they made people curious about it. Oh, what's this all about? Let's go and watch a few video nasties, and people would watch them and just kind of go, well, it's really we don't really understand why there's so much. Um, they're causing so much fuss. I mean, I have to say, looking back, thinking about the kind of things that were on the shelves, I think part of the problem was the marketing of these films and the kind of, what was on the poster for these and what was on the video sleeve were the most kind of like the goriest scenes from the movie, And when I think about kind of it now, the fact that you would go into a video shop, I'd go into a video shop at sort of 14 or 15 years old and just be kind of confronted by these um, just very unpleasant kind of images. I do think, kind of looking back on it, there is a kind of something slightly unpleasant about the sensationalizing of movies by distributors. That's kind of appealing to people's most base kind of instincts, and promising a lot more than they can deliver. I don't know. Yeah, I get. We're all very fascinated by blood and guts, and what happens to your body when it gets torn into pieces, and I think that appealing to that on a very base level is just kind of crass commercialism, really. So that, I mean, looking back on it now, I kind of think it would have been nice not to have been confronted with that kind of imagery as a kid. I don't think it harmed me. I just thought it was
a lot.
yeah, it was fun, but in a very macabre way.
You kind of feel bad for like being like, oh, this is kind of cool
It's
looking
kind
because
of
you're
like,
like,
yeah, there are other things that would have been better for me to watch. I mean,
You're
I
de
have to say, as long as as well as watching Microwave Massacre or something, I was watching.
Is that a movie?
Yeah, that was one of the video nasties, or The Evil Dead, which is a good film. You can't say it's not a very well-made film and in the EC tradition. But as well as watching those movies, I was watching things like Antonioni's The Passenger or Zabriskie Point at the same time. And I just think as well that the video era, it was a time that really opened up the availability of films for people, and that was a really good thing. It was a very positive thing. The people, you know, if you grew up in a small town, as I did, and have a cinema, only three channels on the TV, you really didn't get a chance to see that many films. You only really saw a film when you went out to the city to watch a big movie. But when video came in, you could go down to the video store and get a movie every night, get two movies every night, three movies every night, and so it was people started watching movies, and I think it fostered an appreciation of films.
Did
for a lot of people.
well, did at any point did the horror film genre during when they were being censored, did they ever go underground and try and film? Like, was there always like a, I'm not going to say cult following, but there's a large loyal fan base of simply horror fanatics that really appreciate the art of horror, the genre of it. So I'm curious if there was that kind of connection that we have today where there's a large amount of people that were interested in horror, and did it have to go underground at any point?
Well, I'm not sure if it went underground as such. I mean, there are always those sort of tales of people who going to go into a video store and ask for something under the counter. You know what I mean? Something that,
That's cool. That's really cool, though.
yeah. I don't think I ever did it. Um, but I saw all these movies before the Video Recordings Act came in, so I kind of seen them all. And, but in terms of sent a kind of underground cult of, I think, of horror fans, I think yes. I think horror has always had a kind of a cult audience from the '60s onwards. And a lot of it was to do with magazines. You know, like Forry Ackerman's uh, magazines that came out in the '60s, famous monsters of filmland. That and uh, same kind of movie magazines like that. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to collect horror movie magazines like A House of Hammer, a magazine called Quasimodo's Monster Magazine, and I think that, and really the movies might not be that available, but the cult of horror was really kind of kept going by magazines, I think, in that era. Nowadays, I think the cult of horror really comes down to film festivals. There's so many horror movie festivals now that anybody who's a horror fan will go to a festival, and that's the way you might see the new movies before they're kind of released, before they're streamed even. And that's another way that the sort of the cult of horror is kind of kept going.
Who would you say has had the most impact into the horror genre
As a filmmaker, or just
as a
generally,
filmmaker?
wow, I mean that's
It's
a
a big
big
question.
question.
You mentioned George Romero a couple of times, but he's like a monolith character or iconic with the
Yeah,
whole horror
yeah. I
cinema.
mean, I don't know if there's any individual who you could say is single-handedly, responsible for the ongoing sort of popularity of horror. I think there are certain titans, and when you kind of look back to the '30s, they're probably more actors than directors. Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, because everybody has heard of them. Even non-horror fans, and you just have to say Bela Lugosi to somebody in the street, and immediately it conjures up an old kind of horror movie. So I think in terms of the classic horror movies, it's probably those two actors. Um, I think when you kind of get to the seven, when you get to the sort of 1970s, I think it might come down to individual films rather than directors, because the average person on the street doesn't really know directors.
That's
Let's
true.
face it. Okay, but everybody's heard of The Exorcist.
Oh, 100%, man. I think that's a reference to a lot of
So,
people. Be like,
that's a
yeah,
kind of a tentpole movie for horror, for the '70s. If you say to somebody on the street, name '70s horror movie, just anyone on the street, The Exorcist will probably come up. Something Exorcist Halloween, maybe. So I think it's really about those kind of tentpole movies in terms of the '70s. Um, Nowadays, I don't know. What do you think?
well,
You were talking about some interesting new movies out there, but
I mean, it just seems like I haven't really seen anything different than what we've seen before in the past. I don't mind seeing a Frankenstein film. I really like that. But the last movie I can think of that had kind of like a different take than seeing the common werewolf film or vampire film or zombie film. We were in a zombie point for a good years, it felt like particularly around the time World War Z came out. I think they introduced zombies in a different concept where I was like, if there ever is an apocalypse and that happens, I hope it's not those guys because that you can't live with those. They're running on top of each other and climbing buildings and but when you really examine the way that we are now looking at horror films, it's taken a shift more towards the mental health side of things. And it seemed like we steered away from it for a while. I think around the time in the early 90s, it was a lot of psychopathic killers, a lot of hitchhikers, a lot of things like that that were things that were going on in the news a lot. It seemed like it was depicting exactly what everyone was kind of seeing when they turned on their television, a real actual fear that there could be someone that you could either pick up or someone could break into your house or something of that sort. And then we've now hit this point where it's about zombies and things that it won't happen obviously in our real lives, but then it started shifting towards mental insanity, people that were having certain psychoses or certain disorders that would have a freak out and go do something. The one I'm mentioning specifically is the M. Night Shyamalan film where it's The Visit, I think it's called, where they had the grandparents and it turns out it wasn't actually their grandparents and these people were just mentally unstable and insane. That scared a lot of people because it's like, oh my God, first you got to think of if you're a parent, you have kids and you drop them off at the wrong house, shame on you. But also, it's about these people that have these disorders that I don't think the public, I think they're more scared they don't know much about them. I think that's a scare for a lot of people. If we talk about the politics and the message, is that they just don't understand it. So that's why they're scared of it.
Mm. I mean, I think I agree that there is a very kind of strong subgenre, if you will, in movies that are kind of about the fear of mental illness in a way, or the fear of the some people who are kind of acting in an antisocial manner because of mental illness, or the idea that your world might you might be perceiving the world through this haze of some sort of psychological illness yourself. But I think that there have always been horror movies like that. And I think that maybe what's different, they're taking that subject. I think what's different maybe now is there's a kind of sense is the fear of mental illness becoming kind of endemic within our society. I mean, you could argue that actually that's part of the fear of social collapse, and that Romero in a movie like The Crazies was already exploring this idea that we all operate on some level of insanity that's known only to ourselves, and it's only when there's huge pressure put on us as a society that these various forms of insanity become to show themselves in the sort of dangerous or erratic behavior. I mean, I guess, and without wanting to be sort of too glib about this, I mean, there's the possibility that we're going through, so it feels like we're going through a kind of fresh period of great insecurity and uncertainty. And of course, the pandemic uh, is, an example of that, of it causing such a huge disruption to society that people can't help but feel a great sense of anxiety, insecurity, instability arising from that, and kind of wondering what's going to happen next. I'm pretty sure that a lot of horror films kind of tackling those feelings, maybe not necessarily as pandemic films about the pandemic or about viruses or anything like that, but kind of tackling that feeling of psychological uncertainty or emotional instability, anxiety, and kind of anxiety that's created by this kind of social phenomenon. And I think a lot of horror films probably are dealing with that at the moment.
Kind of like Dracula creation. I mean, Dracula's immortal. I think everyone's got a fear of death, so it's very appealing for a lot of people. Much like with the black cape and everything that he wears and the fangs is pretty interesting. But I always looked at it like in a more immortality aspect. of like a lot of people are kind of aware that their time is limited, and then they get to watch a movie about a person that has to live this curse. But is it a curse? A lot of people question that because the guy can live forever.
Yeah. I mean, vampire movies have become very, very romanticized, haven't they?
Yeah, they're sex symbols now. It's scary.
Exactly. Yeah, they're almost kind of like anti-heroes.
Blame Twilight.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, when you kind of watch these movies, there's not really that much of a downside to being a vampire. I mean, there's so many advantages and not many downsides, you know.
Besides not going out in daylight, that's about it.
Well, yeah, but not not all films kind of follow all of the rules, do they? Actually, I was watching a film from 1962, The Kiss of the Vampire, an old Hammer movie, and the vampires go out in daylight there, but only when it's a bit cloudy and they've got umbrellas.
What do you think? Have you had anything that's really changed your ideas of horror over the, like, let's say, like past 5 years or past 10 years? I'm curious if you came across anything because it seems like you watch a lot of older films. I'm more stuck on the newer times of things. I've seen a couple, like maybe I saw a John Wayne movie because I was interested in Howard Hughes. I like learning about that guy, and I was watching. I think I made it about an hour through, and I was like, "No way, he cannot play Genghis Khan. There's no way. It's a bad fit. Someone should have just did something about it." But it seems like you're interested in a lot of the older films, so I'm curious if you came across anything in the newer area that you feel like would have changed your definition or understanding of horror in a sense. Maybe put new word or new definition to the term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really subscribe to the idea of post horror that has kind of been going around the last few years. You know, the idea that horror movies are moving into new areas of horror. Because for me, horror literature has always done that. You know, the idea that it's got always kind of like expanding the boundaries or exploring the boundaries of what the genre is. You know, horror fiction is maybe because of the nature of writing a short story or writing a novel has always been kind of less kind of genre element kind of defined. You know, where it's very difficult to actually say exactly what it is that's making this a horror story, but it is a horror story. So, you know, a lot of critics have said, well, now, you know, these kind of art house horror movies are really doing that. They're really pushing the boundaries of horror, and that may well be the case. But for me, horror literature has always done that. And you know, some horror movies of the 40s, like the Val Lewton movies of the 40s, have always done that. So for me, I've never really seen anything that's really kind of made me redefine what horror is. It's just, you know, nobody. I don't know if it's even possible to reinvent the wheel at this stage, but I think it is possible to kind of add a few more spokes to the wheel, perhaps, or just duplicate spokes. Uh, I mean, I have to say, I've been kind of disappointed. Maybe I'm always on the lookout for what you've described, you know, and something will be touted on social media, or I'll discover it myself and think, wow, that sounds like something really new, you know, really new. I've never seen anything like that before. And I'll watch it, and maybe it will start out breaking new ground, but inevitably kind of falls into some of the old tropes. You know, I have to say, a movie like Talk to Me kind of did that for me. You know, it's kind of like, hey, it's kind of, yeah. If you think, no, it's not really kind of doing it for me in the way that I thought it was going to be something.
Are you surprised that some horror films can actually, I guess, keep up with the times when it comes to, let's say, Jaws? That has been a horror movie and still probably one of the top ones I'd rate, at least in my mind, for however long from its creation compared to where we're at today. It seems like everyone has heard the name Jaws. It's like kind of like a little bit like a household name, but also if you ask someone, "Hey, have you ever seen Jaws?" They're like, "Yeah, I've seen it." It's everyone has it's gone around the block. They play it on AMC all the time. It's a great movie. I mean, however many they made, I think they made three, if I'm not mistaken, maybe two. I've only think I've seen two.
More than that, probably five, something
Okay.
like that.
But the first two, I mean, they're fantastic. So it's like everyone knows Jaws. You don't even, as soon as you say Jaws, people are like, oh yeah, the shark. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's one that's lasted through when it was created to today. I mean, do you see any of that out there? Can you think of any that has lasted, I would say, the test of, I wouldn't say time, but yeah, test of time.
Yeah, I mean, let's think about Jaws for a moment. I mean, there are many, many other movies that Jaws inspired that could be Jaws. Jaws is basically a monster movie from the
Yeah,
50s.
100%.
It's basically a monster movie from the 50s. But
It's
why is that
fantastic.
endured, you know, whereas others haven't endured? And I guess part of it is because it's not just a horror movie. There are other elements in there that make it a great movie. The empathy you get with the main character, uh, the kind of Moby Dick aspect of it kind of gives it something different. The adventure of it, the comedy, the humor in it uh, really helps the movie.
The way to scare somebody without actually showing the monster, like you mentioned earlier, when they're singing on the boat, they're singing "Show Me the Way to Go Home," and the you hear the boat, something banging into the boat. They all get really, really silent, and you just see one of the boards break, and a little leak starts springing. And it's like then it kind of pans out, shows the boat, and then it goes night, and then it's the next day, and they have to deal with all this water that's being brought into their boat. That's a very interesting, and I don't think you see a lot of it. I can only think of one other film that I've seen where they did a werewolf transformation, but didn't actually show the guy transforming into a werewolf, and they never showed the werewolf actually attacking the dude. They just showed the dude getting mauled up. Like you just, the camera will be over on top of this guy who's flailing his arms all around. I was like, yeah, they probably saved a bunch of money not shooting or making a costume or doing anything like that. But it was also like you were more hearing the noises, and that was enough to scare you.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to what you were saying about Jaws, I think that kind of underlined to me part of the appeal of the film. That it's not just about the monster fighting the monster in the rubber costume. That whole aspect of it, of them being alone on the boat, the kind of nautical aspect of it, the seamanship aspect of it. Uh, I think that those are all things that probably fascinate people. The idea of being out there on the ocean. It's a very kind of primal, also kind of in a way quite a spiritual idea. You against the elements, uh, but battling against this thing that's threatening your livelihoods, threatening your family, threatening your community. That kind of goes way back to the sort of cavemen going out on a hunt. So I think there are those elements to that film. So I guess what I'm saying is that a film has to be extremely rich and work on so many different levels for it to connect on a really kind of primal basis with people, and the idea of trying to look at a film now and think, is that movie going to last, you know, the test of time in the same way? It's very, very difficult to do that. And so I don't really attempt to do it. I mean, it's very. I guess I could turn around and say, "Well, I saw this movie, and I think in 30 years we'll still be talking about it." Well, who knows? Who knows? But uh, I guess the thing with Jaws is it kind of also underlines the fact that it's not just the genre; it's the story. That story would work well in any genre. I mean, look at a movie like Castaway, which is with Tom Hanks.
That's kind of a horror. That's kind of a horror
An
movie.
appeal to a movie like Jaws, which is, you strip away a modern society and could we still survive? And in fact, a movie I was watching last night, and I've got to finish it tonight, it was The Society of Snow. It's that based on the true story of the a Uruguayan rugby team whose plane comes down in the Andes
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they're sort of like they, there's a handful of survivors. They're in the freezing cold. How are they going to survive with no food? And of course, they have to resort to cannibalism.
Based on a true story.
It's based on the true story. It's been made a couple of times. It was made by Frank Marshall into a movie called Alive in the late 1980s, I think. And then I think there was a very low budget kind of exploitation movie in the 70s called Survive, a Mexican movie. But again, that just thinking of Jaws, it's a very got some of the some very similar themes, I suppose. That kind of survival in the wilderness. Uh, can modern person survive? What will they do? How much can they endure? And again, the triumph of the human spirit at the end, which is part of the Jaws theme as well. The human spirit will prevail at the end. But Society of Snow, I think, is up for several Oscars, but it's basically a horror movie, and there are lots of horror. There's lots of horror in it. The horror of an air crash,
Yeah.
the horror of death around you, the horror of freezing to death, you know, of dealing with broken bones and illness and all of that stuff. It's pretty heavy going, but again, it's all about us prevailing over that as human beings.
What would you
So maybe a movie like Society of Snow will people will look back on that and think of it as a good as a good movie in a few years' time.
what would you say out of the three movie tropes that you could choose from man versus man, man versus nature, or man versus oh damn. There's three. I just had it in my head. I forgot it. Man versus nature, man versus man, and man versus monster. Which do you say, which would you think would be, in your perspective, I guess the most focused in the horror genres? Just out of all the films that come out usually, it seems to me it's like it's always man versus monster, but to me the scariest personally is man versus nature. I don't know if you've ever seen The Gray, but you can call that an action movie. I call that a horror movie, but it's in a very intense movie.
Yeah, I just think the best films are the ones that combine all of those three. You know, because those three themes are so closely connected anyway. The idea of man versus nature, that often the monster arises from nature or some mutation of nature, and often that might get man to question what it is to be human. I mean, you get a movie like The Hills Have Eyes, which is a classic horror movie, and that movie has got all of those tropes in there. Because the cannibals are part of nature, just kind of nature gone wrong. And in order to defeat them, the family from modern civilization, has to kind of devolve in a way into savagery, and kind of beat these cannibals at their own game. So there's a sort of man versus man theme going on there as well. So I think when these movies really work well is when they integrate those three into a good sort of metaphor. And the monster, I guess, often functions as that metaphor. You get a good monster, a good antagonist, whether it's human or Godzilla or whoever. Godzilla's another one, I guess. Why Godzilla's so popular is that mutation of nature. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is an incredibly powerful theme in those kind of movies.
What would you say, based on all the work you've done with horror cinema, that you've really analyzed or pulled from it through all your research and just your love of horror films? And then what would you say to anybody out there listening who would want to might examine horror films and try and look for something in horror films? What do you say that it's taught you and what it can teach people?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I've never really just studied horror films on their own. It's always been horror films within a kind of cultural context. So for me, it's always been are kind of weighing up what horror films really mean in relation to what the wider culture is doing, and also, in terms of the way that the media is controlled as well, and the kind of messages that are kind of being put out alongside horror films. Um, so for example, if we go back to the 1950s, the sort of propaganda that was the anti-communist propaganda that was kind of coming out at the time, how did horror films kind of relate to that? Were they doing the cultural work of that propaganda? Were they working alongside that propaganda in a sort of a conservative or even sort of reactionary way? Or were they trying to subvert it? You know, so there's always that dichotomy for me in terms of the genre, that you never really know how a horror movie is working, because it's always working in conjunction with what the culture is doing at the time, and what the discourses are within our culture. So, you can take another example back to the 70s, again in this country, and I mentioned it earlier, the sort of rabies scare, and the way that the government really, in this country, really sort of put out this well, they basically created the scare. To be seen that they were doing something about it, about the possibility of rabies coming over to this country. But at the same time, film producers and novelists and publishers really capitalized on this propaganda. So the books that were coming out were about society collapsing. They're just kind of playing into this kind of government instilled paranoia. And so for me, the question is always what's going on in our culture at the moment, and what role is genre cinema playing, either in challenging that, or in sort of helping to propagate, the kind of fears that are being instilled in us, as a form of, I guess propaganda is a very crass term, but in terms of
Propaganda is a good word for it. That's what it is. It is
yeah, so
messaging
one
you
I don't like
100%.
using,
Yeah.
because it's such a crass term, because it's, what happens in the culture is so much more subtle than just propaganda, isn't it? But that there are certain discourses that are sort of propagated, uh, and it's how the genre is kind of working within those kind of cultural discussions.
Do you think that it's knowingly propagating the messages of the government, or do you think it's kind of like this? I don't know. I wouldn't say they're working together, but in a sense, like, that this is obviously a trending subject because it's being reported on. Why don't we make a movie about it and kind of capturing the times?
I think I think it is more what you said, that kind of the latter, really. I suspect that films that challenge the dominant ideology, the dominant discourse, do so in a conscious way, because the filmmaker has actually been able to see what that discourse is and challenged it. But I suspect that those films that kind of go along with it or propagate it do so in a kind of unknowing way, because there isn't the self-awareness in a way to kind of see what that discourse is. They just kind of go along with it, uh, and I think they go along with under that guise of what you said, that purely commercial. Oh, this is what people are afraid of now, so let's play into that. We can make some money out of it. So I think that tends to be what's on the mind of most studios and filmmakers, in terms of those films that kind of really sort of play into the sort of the horror, the dominant horrors, without in any way, um, uh, kind of what's the word, kind of challenging those horrors, or really kind of investigating them in any real sense. They just kind of like uh, play on them.
Now, is that across the board or is that by specific country? Like, can you tell a difference between the United States and then maybe England or the UK or Australia or any of those other countries out there?
I don't think it's necessarily across the board, but I think that there is a tendency for, you know, for big, for large, for films that are mainstream, in effect, mainstream movies. They've gone through a series of gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers are not necessarily interested in challenging the status quo.
That's true.
They just want to keep things as they are because they're making a lot of money out of it. So I have a sense that most mainstream big releases um, are going to, very few of them are going to, challenge the dominant culture in any way, shape, or form. But I think there are, in other countries, there are elements of alternative cinema that come up through the horror genre. Uh, through, as I say, the very self-aware filmmakers who are often not part of the mainstream, like some women filmmakers, some indigenous filmmakers. A film like Blood Quantum, for example, sort of indigenous native American horror movie about zombies. Well, that movie is going to want to talk about what it is to be a Native American. There've been Inuit horror movies as well, and filmmakers who want to talk about what it is to be an Inuit, and their experiences, their lived experiences within the society that they come up into. So I think what we get is really kind of like individual voices that kind of come out that are kind of like, in a way, again, I hate to use the word protest, but there is a kind of sense of challenge or confrontation, confronting what the norm is, and those are the there are plenty that come out each generation. But I guess in terms of the classics of the 70s, the people like Cronenberg and Romero, they're the ones who they're not making, they were never ever going to make mainstream movies. They're always going to make kind of movies with an individual alternative voice.
Well, John, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Yeah, well, I guess the best place really to go is just onto my Twitter account, which is System Shocks at System Shocks. And also, I've got an Amazon page as well where you can find links to all my books. Those are the best places really to find my writing.
And I'll link all those in the description so people will be able to click on them, check out some of your books, and also follow you on Twitter. I followed you on Twitter this morning.
Yeah,
Uh,
excellent.
I
I will
didn't know you
follow
had a
you back.
Twitter. Most people are always like, "Oh, I don't do social media." I mean, I don't really do it either. Just kind of like I check usually, I don't know, if you get a message from a friend or something like that. But sometimes you come across good stuff. It's how I started finding out that like movies were going on there. I don't know, something with my algorithm tricked me up. I went to the movies once. The next thing I know, I'm getting movie trailer previews all the time now, and I'm actually pretty happy with it.
Yeah, again, it's like anything else. Use it intelligently. Use it for information and communication, and it's good. I mean, I've always found. I mean, I just self-published my latest book, 40 Cult Movies, and
Is The Big Lebowski on that?
no, I'll put it on the next one.
I'll
That's one of
say
my favorite
that's
films.
all my time. That's my time favorite.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's one of those movies that you know every line of dialogue to.
Yeah.
Fantastic. But yeah, well, I just self-published the latest book, 40 Cult Movies, and I just found that, social media is just so important if you do something like that. And I think it's the same for filmmaking. When you're working independently, social media is a really good tool, because you can let people know that your work's there, and Uh, yeah, I mean, it's certainly helped me, I think.
Well, John, I'm going to make sure I link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.